Hello, welcome to Jessi's Craft Corner. Today I am filming part 2 of my Hasbro Queen Amidala makeover. If you would like to watch part 1, I will link it in the description box below. Let's get started. So this is how the sleeves look with all of the piping sewn on, and I showed you how to do that in part 1. And now you're going to do the exact same thing on all of the dress panels. Only instead of using the stretch velvet on the back, you are going to use the lining cotton, which I showed you in video 1. And then you're going to end up doing this about 1,000 times. And after all your piping is done, you're going to stitch on the sleeves. I'm using a basic back stitch just to make sure that it's nice and secure. In case you're wondering why I use 1 thread instead of 2 on the doll clothes, it's because it makes the seams much smaller and they don't need the same strength and durability that you use on regular human clothing. I'm also whip stitching around all of the seam allowance just to make sure that it does not fray, because let's face it, there's nothing worse than having your sleeves actually like fray and rip off of your clothes, am I right? So after you have the sleeve sewn on, you are going to sew up the sleeve lining using a black thread. And the reason that I am actually stitching it up the shoulder seam is because I gave it quite a bit of thought, and it seemed like that would be the easiest way to actually attach all the pieces together, especially since the side panel, like normally when you're sewing sleeves together, you would actually stitch it up the bottom of the sleeve, but the bottom of the sleeve actually lines up with the center of the side panels on the dress. So I decided over the shoulder would be the best way to do it, especially because it's going to be covered with our faux piping later, so you're not even going to see that the shoulder seam is even there. So after the stretch velvet of the sleeve lining is all stitched up, I'm using a red thread to go through and stitch together the over sleeve. And once again, like I said, it's not going to be visible when it's done, but you do want to make sure that you attach down the shoulders of the dress. Make sure that your stitches are really small if you ever decide to do this project. I'm not 100% sure why anybody else would do this, because obviously I am insane because I've been working on this for like 2 weeks. But if you make your stitches really large, they won't be able to be covered up by the piping later. And now it's time for some of that lovely, lovely piping action. In case you're wondering, all this video recording is actually playing at about 20 times speed, so this took a really long time for me to do. And here I am actually tacking down the shoulder seams inside of the dress, making sure that there aren't any raw edges, once again because nobody wants it to fray, especially after we spent all this time working on it. So now that my piping is all finished on the sleeve, I'm actually using tiny little tacking stitches to fold over the edge of the stretch velvet inner sleeve to make that nice little fur cuff that goes all the way around the edges of the sleeve. If you decide to do this, just make sure that you take your time to make sure that your fur edging is all about the same width all the way around the sleeve, because that's what will make it look neat in the end. Alright, now that our sleeves are all attached, it's time to sew up the back of the dress, which, I can't tell you how much I was looking forward to doing this. It's pretty much the thought of doing this was the only thing that got me through all of that piping earlier. So I'm just doing tiny little running stitches all the way down the length of the back, and then I'm going over and doing whip stitches to close up the lining on the back so that there aren't any visible seams on, so that there aren't any visible hems on the inside. While I'm doing it, I am making sure to leave open the holes on the dress for the CN jewels to go in later. Now I am splitting the embroidery floss in half that I used to do all of the piping to do the weird little squiggly detail on the collar piece. So let's get started. And I'm basically installing it the exact same way I did it on all the faux piping. I'm just using tiny little tacking stitches. I'm also twisting it in between each stitch so that the thread stays nice and tight, because it has a tendency to want to fray, and if it does that, it looks quite messy. Now I'm installing a brass hoop on the bottom of the dress. It's an 8-inch hoop. I picked it up from Joann's for like $3 or something like that. And it's going to serve a couple of purposes on the finished dress. The first is that it's actually going to keep the bottom in that beautiful circle shape, so it actually works as a really nice support piece. The second one is it will actually weigh down the bottom of the dress to make sure that everything stays nice and flat once I install the lighting later. Okay, time to attach the fur strips. This is actually just some really soft craft fur. Once again, I got this at Joann's. I cut some strips out that are about 3/4 of an inch wide, and honestly, this is the part of the dress where you can get away with actually having some pretty messy stitches because the fur is so thick and fluffy that you'll actually never see them. I'm still trying to make them look neat. It does help if you are holding the fur down out of the way while you're sewing. Also, pro tip, if you're ever cutting faux fur, make sure that you cut from the back side, because that'll help you get your line straight. So it worked out incredibly convenient that the fur that I bought in a square actually was the exact right length to go halfway around the dress, so only had to cut 2 strips. Woohoo! When you're joining the 2 ends of the strips together, make sure that the fur is facing in the same direction, because that'll give a seamless appearance later. Okay, so on the underside, once again, I'm just using my basic tack stitches. I am trying to keep it inside of the edge of the previous stitches, which you can see as the little black dots on there. And the reason for this is because in case I have any that goes all the way through the lining fabric, I do not want it to be visible on the outside of the dress. And yes, I definitely had to vacuum my craft room after cutting all this fabric, because there was bits of fuzzy fake fur everywhere. Okay, so for the collar, I did originally try to make it out of the same fabric as the dress, but the fabric just did not want to cooperate on something that small, so I ended up using some cross grain ribbon, which I cut 2 lengths that were the same circumference as the neck hole, and then I folded each one in half lengthwise, and then folded it in half widthwise, and whip stitched it together to make 2 halves of the collar to go around. That way it would line up with the center back seam. And after marking the center, I just whip stitched it on with tiny little stitches to make sure that they wouldn't really be visible on the finished dress. And last but not least, I am attaching the tabards that I made in part 1 with nice little running stitches. I did it back and forth a couple of times just to make sure that they were nice and secure, and I used photo reference to make sure that everything was lined up in the correct position where it was supposed to be. Alright, so this is the dress where it's at so far. This is the end of part 2. I'm going to continue on with part 3, where I'm going to address the inner sleeves that are supposed to go on here, as well as how I'm going to make the headdress. And I will be making and installing the lighted CN jewels that'll go in the bottom part. So that is all for now. Thank you so much for watching and hope you have a great rest of your day.